Chapter 8. Steve had gone back to his house to get some rest, since he'd been up most of night waiting for her to return. Since she'd arrived, Jade had made a habit of shifting late each night and spending several hours in the woods before returning to the house. He waited up for her each night, and the lack of sleep was catching up to him. He might not get more than a few hours each night normally, but recently he hadn't even gotten that. He didn't know how much longer he could handle this. He'd left Jade once before because he wasn't sure he could keep his hands off her. Now, here she was again, and though he hadn't thought it was possible, she was even more attractive. She'd grown into her body. It sounded backwards, but it was true. Now she had a confidence that hadn't been there before. Then there was the way she stood up to him. Every time she stood there confronting him about something he'd done or said, he got hard. He fought to control his dick every time he saw her. Now he had less reason to keep his hands to himself. Yes, she was still 10 years younger, but at nearly 30 he could no longer tell himself that she was a child. There was something under all that attitude though, something that had her flinching every time she was touched or startled. It made him want to find out what it was, to protect her and take that haunted shadow from her eyes. He had to fight to remain where he was every night, as he watched her step onto the porch and take off into the trees. The temptation to follow was strong, but he'd managed each night, at least so far, to stay hidden in the shadows. He'd been surprised by her mid-air shift that first night. It was an uncommon skill, one that took a lot of practice to master, especially as smoothly as she'd done it. He could do it, as could the con, but he didn't know anyone else who could, not until now. That she'd taken the time and effort to learn surprised him. That night he'd waited for hours for her to come back, only going out to look for her when dawn approached and she hadn't yet returned. Finding her asleep in the V of a tree had thrown him. He never would have taken the city girl who'd shown up that afternoon for someone as comfortable with herself and her cat to do something like that. Few people, even Kitsune, were that comfortable in the wilderness. He'd been trying to avoid Jade until she gave up and went home, but his duties wouldn't let him stay away. He ended up seeing her every day, if not several times a day, even if she wasn't aware he was near. It affected him. He didn't know if he could hold out. It was already a real struggle to keep his hands off her. He longed to touch her, to comfort her, and his skin itched to touch her. The only way he was managing so far was to stay quiet and use his anger to keep her at a distance. He had to because he knew once he let himself touch her, not just letting her touch him, but if he gave in and initiated the touch, he might not be able to stop. He'd left all those years ago because he knew, eventually, his control would snap. He'd feared he would scare or worse, hurt the innocent girl she'd been. He hadn't trusted himself to keep his distance. He still didn't, but did he have a choice? He heard footsteps approaching the cabin, and looked out the window to find the object of his thoughts, headed in his direction. Cursing under his breath, he went to the door. He jerked it open, and her scent hit him like a punch in the gut. He felt it immediately, that pull, the instant need to touch her, to pull her close, to protect her with everything he had. "What do you want?" Steve snapped, his voice sounding harsher than he'd intended. "I brought lunch," she lifted the bag. "What makes you think that I haven't already eaten?" She seemed to deflate before his eyes. "I assumed since Rebecca sent me out here, she normally made your lunch." Steve flushed and looked down. "She does." "Then here it is." She handed him the bag and turned to go. "I'll let you eat in peace." She sounded dispirited, and it made him feel guilty. The bag rustled as he looked inside. "Wait," he reached out and grabbed her arm. "Don't go." He noticed how she jumped at his touch, but her face revealed nothing as she turned to look at him. "Why not? You've made it abundantly clear that you don't want me here." She used anger and snide comeback in an attempt to cover the flash of terror he'd scented from her.